Gary Mitchell never imagined he would find himself in a courtroom at 62 years of age. The decorated Navy veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan sat nervously at the defendant's table, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the collar of his only dress shirt. The charge was minor, a parking violation that had escalated due to missed court dates and unpaid fines. But for Gary, whose PTSD made crowded public spaces nearly unbearable, this day represented a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. Gary had tried his best to avoid this moment. He had called the courthouse 3 times to explain his situation, but the system seemed designed to confuse rather than help. Each call led him through a maze of automated messages and transfers that left him more frustrated than before. By the time he reached a real person, his anxiety was so high that he could barely explain himself clearly. The court clerk had been polite but firm. He needed to appear before the judge or risk a warrant for his arrest. The morning of the court date, Gary woke before dawn. Sleep had been difficult, as it often was since he returned from overseas. Nightmares of the explosion that had injured him and killed 2 of his friends still haunted him nearly every night. He had lain awake watching the shadows on his ceiling, wondering how his life had led to this point. At 5:30, he finally gave up on sleep and began the slow process of getting ready. Dressing was always a challenge with his bad leg. The doctors had done their best, but some injuries never fully heal. Gary had refused the option of amputation, determined to keep the leg even though it caused him constant pain. Getting into his dress pants took nearly 15 minutes, and by the time he had buttoned his shirt and tied his tie, he was already exhausted. Still, he took extra care with his appearance today. He polished his shoes, something he hadn't done in years, and pinned his Purple Heart to his lapel. If he was going to face a judge, he would do it with dignity. The bus ride downtown was uncomfortable. Each bump in the road sent sharp pains through his leg, and the crowded space triggered his anxiety. Gary focused on his breathing, counting slowly as his therapist had taught him. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The technique helped, but only barely. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. The security line at the courthouse stretched out the door. Gary leaned heavily on his cane as he waited, shifting his weight to ease the pressure on his bad leg. When it was finally his turn, he struggled to remove his belt and empty his pockets with one hand while balancing with the other. The security guard, noticing his difficulty, moved to help him. "Vietnam?" the guard asked quietly as he held Gary's belongings. "Afghanistan," Gary replied. "Navy," the guard nodded with respect. "My son's in the Marines, 2nd tour." "Tell him to keep his head down," Gary said, the familiar phrase coming automatically. "Always do. Good luck in there today." Inside the courtroom, Gary found a seat near the back, grateful to be off his feet. His court-appointed attorney, Susan Baker, spotted him and came over. She was younger than he expected, probably in her early 30s with kind eyes behind professional glasses. She carried a stack of folders tucked under one arm and balanced a coffee cup in her other hand. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Susan Baker, your public defender." She held out her hand and Gary shook it firmly. "I've reviewed your case. It should be straightforward. The judge today is Harold Freeman. He's strict but fair." Gary nodded, not trusting his voice. The courtroom was filling up, and the noise level was rising. Each new voice added to the jumble of sounds that made it harder for him to focus. Susan seemed to notice his discomfort. "Are you all right, Mr. Mitchell?" "Crowds," he managed to say. "Not good with crowds since—" He gestured vaguely at his leg. Understanding dawned in Susan's eyes. "I'll see if we can get your case called early, and I'll stay right beside you, okay?" Gary nodded gratefully. Susan spoke briefly with the court clerk before returning to sit beside him. She explained the procedure in a low, calm voice that helped ground him. The judge would enter, cases would be called in order, and when it was his turn he would need to stand and address the judge as "Your Honor." Simple enough in theory, but Gary worried about how his leg would handle standing for any length of time. At precisely 9 a.m., The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Freeman entered the courtroom. Gary struggled to his feet, gripping his cane tightly. The judge was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing as he surveyed the courtroom. He moved with the precise efficiency of someone used to command. "Be seated," Judge Freeman said, his voice deep and authoritative. The rustle of movement filled the room as people sat. Gary eased back into his seat with relief. The first few cases moved quickly. Traffic violations, minor disputes, small claims. Judge Freeman was indeed strict, showing little patience for excuses or wasted time. Gary's anxiety grew as he watched. What would this stern-faced judge make of his situation? When the clerk called, "Mitchell, Gary," Susan touched his arm gently. "That's us." The walk to the front of the courtroom felt endless. Gary was acutely aware of every eye on him, every tap of his cane against the floor. Susan stayed close, slowing her pace to match his. By the time they reached the defendant's table, Gary's leg was throbbing painfully, but he remained standing as Susan had instructed. "Gary Mitchell, Your Honor," Susan began. "Mr. Mitchell is here regarding unpaid parking violations and missed court dates." Judge Freeman peered down at him over reading glasses. "Mr. Mitchell, these violations date back 6 months. Can you explain why you've ignored multiple notices from this court?" Gary swallowed hard. "I didn't ignore them, Your Honor. I tried to call and explain. I have trouble getting around sometimes, and crowded places are difficult for me since Afghanistan." The judge's expression changed slightly. "Afghanistan?" he asked, his tone shifting. "Yes, Your Honor." "United States Navy, retired." Without thinking, Gary straightened his posture, shoulders back despite the pain as years of military training took over. Judge Freeman noticed the Purple Heart pin on Gary's lapel. His eyes lingered on it for a moment before returning to the file before him. When he looked up again, something in his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "I see you're using a cane, Mr. Mitchell. Is that from your service?" "Yes, Your Honor. IED explosion in 2010. My right leg was badly damaged." The courtroom had grown quieter. Even the whispered conversations in the gallery had stopped as people listened to the exchange. Judge Freeman removed his glasses and set them carefully on the bench. "Mr. Mitchell, before we proceed with your case, would you mind telling the court what ship you served on?" The unexpected question caught Gary off guard. He glanced at Susan, who looked equally surprised before answering. "The USS Constellation, Your Honor, 2003 to 2011. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Judge Freeman's expression changed visibly. He leaned forward, his stern demeanor giving way to something more personal. "The Constellation," he repeated, almost to himself. Then louder, "I served on her predecessor in the 90s. Gary felt a shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The judge was no longer just a distant authority figure but a fellow sailor. For the first time since entering the courthouse, Gary felt his anxiety begin to ease slightly. "Small world, Your Honor," he said, managing a faint smile. "Indeed it is, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Freeman replied. "Indeed it is." He paused, seeming to consider something. Then, in a move that surprised everyone in the courtroom, Judge Freeman stood up from behind the bench. "Bailiff, I'd like a brief recess before we continue with Mr. Mitchell's case." The judge glanced at Gary with an unreadable expression. "When we reconvene, I have a few more questions I'd like to ask the defendant." As the bailiff announced the recess, Gary looked questioningly at Susan. "Is this normal?" he whispered. Susan shook her head slightly. "No," she replied quietly. "It's not normal at all." During the recess, Gary sat quietly at the defendant's table, his mind racing. The unexpected connection with Judge Freeman had caught him completely off guard. Susan Baker sat beside him, reviewing her notes, and occasionally glancing at her client with curious eyes. "What do you think he wants to ask you?" she whispered. Gary shook his head. "No idea. Navy men can be hard to read." The 10-minute recess stretched to 15, then 20. The other people waiting for their cases to be called grew restless, shifting in their seats and checking their watches. Gary remained still, the way he had learned to do during long watches at sea. Patience was a sailor's virtue. Finally, the side door opened and Judge Freeman returned. Everyone rose as the bailiff called the court to order. Gary noticed that the judge carried a small, worn book that hadn't been on the bench before. As everyone settled back into their seats, Judge Freeman looked directly at Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, please approach the bench." Susan quickly gathered her papers. "Your Honor, as Mr. Mitchell's attorney, I should—" "You may accompany him, Ms. Baker," the judge said with a nod. The walk to the judge's bench felt even longer than before. Gary's leg had stiffened during the wait, and each step sent sharp pains up his thigh. He refused to grimace, keeping his face neutral as he had been trained to do when in pain. Military habits died hard. When they reached the bench, Judge Freeman looked down at them with an expression Gary couldn't quite read. It wasn't the stern look of a judge about to deliver a harsh sentence, but something more personal, almost gentle. "Mr. Mitchell, during our recess, I took the liberty of reviewing your service record." Gary raised his eyebrows in surprise. "My service record, Your Honor?" "I have some connections at the VA," Judge Freeman explained. "What I found was remarkable." He opened the book on his desk, which Gary now realized was not a book at all but a folder of papers. 2 tours in Afghanistan, numerous commendations, the Purple Heart, which I see you're wearing today. Gary's hand unconsciously moved to touch the pin on his lapel. "It's just a piece of metal, Your Honor." "We both know it's more than that." "Sailor," Judge Freeman said quietly, using the term that made Gary stand a little straighter despite himself. "What concerns me is what I didn't find in these records." Susan shifted beside Gary. "Your Honor, I'm not sure I understand how Mr. Mitchell's military service relates to the parking violations before the court today." Judge Freeman nodded. "A fair question, Counselor. I believe they relate directly to Mr. Mitchell's ability to comply with court orders." He turned his attention back to Gary. "According to these records, you've never applied for disability benefits. Is that correct?" Gary felt his face grow warm. He didn't like talking about this, especially not in a crowded courtroom. "That's correct, Your Honor." "May I ask why not?" Gary hesitated. How could he explain it? The guilt he felt for surviving, when others hadn't. The feeling that he didn't deserve help when he could still walk, even if it was with a cane. The overwhelming complexity of the VA system that seemed designed to wear down even the most determined veteran. "Other people need it more, Your Honor," he finally said. "I can manage." Judge Freeman's expression softened further. "Mr. Mitchell, these parking violations, they're all from the VA Medical Center parking lot, aren't they?" Gary nodded. "Yes, sir. I have physical therapy there twice a week. The handicapped spaces are always full and the regular spots are too far for me to walk on bad days. Sometimes I double park or use the loading zone. I know it's wrong, but you were trying to make your medical appointments," Judge Freeman finished for him. "Appointments that might not be necessary if you had proper home care." Gary didn't answer. What could he say? The judge was right. Judge Freeman closed the folder and leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only Gary and Susan could hear him clearly. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm about to make an unusual request, and you are free to decline. But before I do, I want to share something with you." He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a forearm marked with a long, jagged scar. "Kabul, 1991. Different war, same enemy. I was a young lieutenant then, fresh out of Annapolis. Our convoy hit a landmine." He rolled his sleeve back down. "I was the only survivor." Gary felt a connection with the judge that transcended their current roles. It was the unspoken brotherhood of those who had seen war up close. "My request, Mr. Mitchell, is this. Would you be willing to share your story with this court? Not just what happened to your leg, but what happened after. The struggles a decorated veteran faces when he comes home." Susan started to object. "Your Honor, I'm not sure this is relevant to—" "It's relevant, Counselor," Judge Freeman interrupted gently. "It's relevant to every person in this courtroom who drives past veterans holding signs on street corners. It's relevant to every taxpayer who wonders why more isn't being done to help our servicemen and women. And it's directly relevant to why, Mr. Mitchell is standing before me today with unpaid parking tickets. He looked back at Gary. You don't have to do this. We can proceed with your case in the normal manner, but I think your story needs to be heard. Gary looked around the courtroom. All eyes were on him now, curious and expectant. His first instinct was to refuse. He had spent years trying not to talk about Afghanistan, about the explosion, about the nightmares and pain that followed him home. But maybe the judge was right. Maybe it was time to speak. I'll tell it, Your Honor, he said quietly. But I'm not sure where to begin. Judge Freeman nodded. Begin with the day that changed everything. April 12, 2010, the day you earned that Purple Heart. Gary took a deep breath. The courtroom was completely silent now, every person leaning forward slightly, waiting. Even the bailiff, a former Marine who had seen it all, stood at attention, his usual bored expression replaced with one of solemn respect. April 12, 2010, Gary repeated, his voice gaining strength. It was a Tuesday, hot, even for Afghanistan in April. Our unit was on routine patrol outside Kandahar, checking for IEDs, along the supply route. I was with 5 other men, all of them younger than my own son. As he spoke, Gary's mind traveled back to that dusty road, the smell of diesel fuel and sweat, the constant tension of knowing that death could be hiding beneath any innocent-looking pile of trash or freshly turned soil. We had just passed a small village when our lead vehicle hit the IED. The explosion flipped the Humvee completely over. I was in the second vehicle. We stopped immediately and took up defensive positions, expecting enemy fire. Gary paused, the memories vivid and painful. Judge Freeman nodded encouragingly. But there was no ambush, no gunfire, just the burning vehicle and the cries of the injured. I ran to help, not thinking about snipers or secondary explosives. All I could think about were the boys in that Humvee. Gary's voice grew softer and people in the courtroom leaned forward to hear. I pulled 2 men out before I realized I was injured. Shrapnel had torn through my right leg. I didn't feel it at first. The third man I reached was Petty Officer Frank Collins. He was my friend. We had watched football games together, shared pictures of our families. Gary's voice broke slightly. He died in my arms, asking me to tell his mother that he wasn't afraid. A woman in the back of the courtroom let out a small sob. Gary continued, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, seeing not the courtroom but the dusty road in Afghanistan. The fourth man, Kyle Peters, was already gone. The fifth, Danny Martinez, died at the field hospital that night. I spent 18 months in hospitals, had 7 surgeries on my leg. The doctors wanted to amputate, but I refused. Don't know if that was brave or stupid. Gary shifted his weight, the pain in his leg a constant reminder of that day. When I finally came home, everything had changed. Or maybe I had changed. Crowds made me nervous. Loud noises sent me into a panic. I couldn't sleep without seeing their faces. The VA gave me therapy, medications, but nothing really fixed what was broken. He looked directly at Judge Freeman. Now. The hardest part wasn't learning to walk again, Your Honor. It was learning to live with the fact that I came home when others didn't. The courtroom remained silent as Gary's words hung in the air. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had stopped. Judge Freeman nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Gary's face. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Mitchell, the judge said quietly. Would you mind telling the court what happened when you returned home? The challenges you faced? Gary shifted his weight, trying to ease the pressure on his bad leg. Susan quickly noticed and whispered something to the bailiff, who brought over a chair. Gary nodded gratefully as he sat down. When I first got back to the States, I spent 6 months at Walter Reed. Gary continued. The physical recovery was just the beginning. They can fix broken bones, but the other stuff, the memories, the guilt, it's harder to repair. Gary looked down at his hands, weathered and calloused from years of work. I had a wife then, Diane. She tried her best, but I wasn't the same man who left, I was angry all the time, or so quiet she said it was like living with a ghost. She stuck it out for 2 years after I came home. I don't blame her for leaving. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Many new veterans who had similar stories. I had a good job before Afghanistan, construction manager. Couldn't do that anymore with my leg. The company offered me a desk job, but I couldn't handle being inside all day staring at a computer. Made me feel trapped. So I quit. Lived off savings for a while, then took whatever work I could get that didn't require much standing or walking. Judge. Freeman leaned forward. And your housing situation now, Mr. Mitchell? Gary hesitated, embarrassment coloring his face. I rent a small apartment on the east side. It's on the 3rd floor of an old building with no elevator. Some days I can barely make it up the stairs. But it's what I can afford. And the VA? Judge Freeman asked. What assistance have they provided? They cover my medical care and physical therapy. And I see a counselor twice a month for the PTSD. But I never applied for disability. Kept telling myself others needed it more. Kept thinking I'd get better, get back to my old life. Gary gave a small, sad smile. Guess I'm stubborn that way. Judge Freeman made a note on the pad in front of him. These parking violations, Mr. Mitchell, can you explain the circumstances behind them? Gary nodded. My physical therapy appointments are at 9 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The handicapped spaces fill up early. The regular spaces are at the far end of the lot, too far for me to walk on bad days. So sometimes I park in the loading zone or the staff area. I know it's wrong, but I didn't want to miss my appointments. And the missed court dates, the judge prompted. The first one, I was in the hospital with pneumonia. The second, I got the date mixed up. The PTSD affects my memory sometimes, and the third... Gary looked down, clearly embarrassed. I couldn't face it. The idea of coming to this crowded courthouse, all the people, the noise. I just couldn't do it. But then they said there'd be a warrant, so here I am. Judge Freeman studied Gary for a long moment. Then he looked at Susan Baker. Counselor, do you have anything to add? Susan stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell's case clearly demonstrates how our system fails those who have served our country. His parking violations stem directly from his service-related disabilities and his attempts to receive treatment for those disabilities. We ask the court for leniency in this matter. Judge Freeman nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Counselor. He turned his attention back to Gary. Mr. Mitchell, I have one more question. If you were to receive proper support, disability benefits, accessible housing, transportation assistance, would that make a difference in your ability to comply with laws and regulations like proper parking? Gary considered the question carefully. It would, Your Honor. I don't want to break rules. I was a Navy man. We live by rules. But sometimes it feels like I have to choose between following every rule and just surviving. The judge nodded again, seemingly satisfied with the answer. Then, to everyone's surprise, he removed his black robe and stepped down from the bench. The courtroom buzzed with confused whispers. This was highly unusual behavior for a judge. Judge Freeman walked slowly to where Gary sat. He stopped a respectful distance away, not crowding the veteran whose PTSD made him uncomfortable in close quarters. Mr. Mitchell, with the court's permission, I'd like to share something with everyone here today. He looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with various spectators. Something I believe they need to understand. Gary looked confused, but nodded. Of course, Your Honor. Judge Freeman turned to address the entire courtroom, standing beside Gary rather than looming over him from the bench. Without his robe and his shirt and tie, he looked less like a judge and more like a regular man. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard today from Mr. Mitchell is not unique. There are thousands of veterans just like him in our city, in our country, who struggle daily with the visible and invisible wounds of war. The judge's voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. I want to share some facts with you. 22 veterans take their own lives every day in this country. Many more live with chronic pain, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and other service-related conditions. And yet, our systems often put obstacles in their path rather than removing them. He gestured toward Gary. Mr. Mitchell earned a Purple Heart serving our country. He pulled fellow sailors from a burning vehicle while injured himself. And yet today he sits before us as a defendant because he parked improperly while trying. To receive medical care for injuries sustained in service. Judge Freeman's voice grew more passionate. As a fellow veteran, I find this deeply troubling. As a judge sworn to uphold the law, I find myself in a difficult position. The law is clear about parking violations, but the law is also meant to serve justice, and I see little justice in punishing a man for trying to access the care he earned through his sacrifice. The courtroom was completely silent now. Several people were dabbing at their eyes. The court reporter had stopped typing and was watching the judge with rapt attention. Judge Freeman turned back to Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to make another unusual request if you'll permit me." Gary nodded, clearly moved by the judge's words. "Anything, Your Honor." "Would you allow me to shake your hand? Not as a judge to a defendant, but as one sailor to another. As one American grateful for your service and sacrifice." Gary blinked rapidly, fighting back unexpected emotion. Slowly, with some difficulty, he rose from his chair and straightened his posture as much as his injured leg would allow. He extended his hand. Judge Freeman grasped it firmly. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but its significance wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of one man seeing another not for his circumstances, but for his character. "Thank you, sailor," Judge Freeman said quietly. "Thank you, sir," Gary replied, his voice slightly hoarse. As they broke the handshake, a woman in the third row of the gallery began to clap. Others quickly joined in. Soon the entire courtroom was filled with applause, not just polite applause, but the kind that comes from genuine emotion. The bailiff made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, but even he was smiling. Judge Freeman raised his hand, and the applause gradually subsided. He returned to the bench and put his robe back on, transforming once more into the symbol of judicial authority. But something had changed in the courtroom. The formal barrier between the judge and those before him had been momentarily bridged, revealing the humanity on both sides. "In light of the testimony we've heard," Judge Freeman began, his voice now back to its official tone, "this court will take a 15-minute recess before rendering a decision in the case of Gary Mitchell. Court is in recess." As the bailiff called out the formal announcement, Gary looked at Susan with confusion. "What just happened?" he whispered. Susan smiled, her eyes suspiciously bright. "I think you just changed how this court sees veterans, Mr. Mitchell. And I think your parking tickets may be the least important outcome of today's hearing." During the 15-minute recess, Gary remained at the defendant's table with Susan. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, many people glancing in Gary's direction with newfound respect. "Do you need anything? Water?" Susan asked, concerned about her client's well-being after the emotional testimony. Gary shook his head. "I'm fine, just surprised by all this. I came in expecting to pay a fine or worse. Never thought I'd be telling my life story to a room full of strangers. Judge Freeman is known for being fair, but I've never seen him do anything like this before," Susan admitted. "In all my years practicing in this courthouse, I've never seen a judge step down from the bench to shake a defendant's hand." A young woman approached their table hesitantly. She looked to be in her 20s with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her eyes were red, suggesting she had been crying. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly. "I'm Lily Winters. My brother Sam served in Afghanistan too. He didn't come home." Her voice wavered slightly. "I just wanted to thank you for your service and for speaking today. It helped me understand some things about what Sam went through." Gary's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your brother, Ms. Winters. What unit was he with?" "Marines, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Gary nodded with respect. "The Dark Horse Battalion. They saw some of the heaviest fighting. Your brother was a brave man." Lily smiled through fresh tears. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot coming from someone who was there." She glanced toward the door. "I should get back to my seat. They'll be calling us back in soon." As she walked away, Gary noticed several other people watching him with similar expressions of empathy and gratitude. It was an unfamiliar feeling. For years he had tried to blend in to hide his service and his injuries. Today, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not with pity but with understanding. The bailiff called the court back to order, and everyone rose as Judge Freeman returned to the bench. The judge seemed different somehow, more determined. He had several papers in his hand that hadn't been there before. "Please be seated," he said, his voice carrying the familiar authority of the bench. As everyone sat down, he looked directly at Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, please approach the bench again." With Susan at his side, Gary made his way forward once more. His leg was really bothering him now, the pain sharp and insistent after standing and sitting repeatedly throughout the morning. He did his best to hide his discomfort, but Judge Freeman noticed his slight grimace. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you're in pain. This won't take long." The judge looked down at the papers before him. "During our recess, I made several phone calls. I spoke with the district attorney's office, the Veterans Affairs liaison for our courthouse, and a contact at the mayor's office of Veteran Services." Gary and Susan exchanged puzzled glances. "Before I render my decision on your case, I want to address the larger issues that brought you here today." Judge Freeman held up one of the papers. "This is a letter from the VA hospital, confirming that you have indeed been attending physical therapy twice weekly for the past 3 years. Despite the difficulties with parking and transportation." He set that paper aside and picked up another. "This is a report from your PTSD counselor, stating that you have never missed a scheduled appointment except when hospitalized, and that you have made significant progress despite your continued struggles." Gary shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like his personal medical information being discussed in open court, but he understood the judge was making a point. "Your Honor," Susan began, "while we appreciate your thoroughness, I'm concerned about my client's privacy rights regarding his medical—" Judge Freeman held up a hand. "I understand your concern, Counselor. Rest assured I've obtained proper releases for this information. Mr. Mitchell's privacy is important, but so is making sure this court fully understands the context of his case." He turned back to Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, based on everything I've learned today, I've come to a decision about your parking violations. But before I announce that decision, I have something else I'd like to address." The judge gestured to a man in a dark suit who had been sitting in the front row. The man stood and approached the bench carrying a leather portfolio. "This is Mr. Alan Rivera from the Mayor's Office of Veteran Services," Judge Freeman explained. "Mr. Rivera, would you please tell the court what we discussed during the recess?" Alan Rivera nodded and turned to face the gallery. "Judge Freeman contacted me about Mr. Mitchell's situation. After reviewing his service record and current circumstances, we've determined that Mr. Mitchell qualifies for several programs he hasn't been utilizing." Rivera opened his portfolio and removed some documents. "First, the Veterans Housing Assistance program can help Mr. Mitchell find a ground-floor apartment or one in a building with an elevator at a rent comparable to what he's paying now. Second, our transportation service can provide rides to and from medical appointments, eliminating the need to drive and park at the VA facility." Gary stared at Rivera in disbelief. He had heard of these programs but had always assumed they were for veterans worse off than himself, those who couldn't walk at all or who had nowhere to live. "Additionally," Rivera continued, "our office can help Mr. Mitchell complete his application for disability benefits. Based on his Purple Heart status and documented injuries, he should qualify for both VA disability and Social Security disability income. This would significantly improve his financial situation." Judge Freeman nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Rivera." He turned back to Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, are you willing to accept this assistance?" Gary hesitated. Pride had kept him from seeking help for years. The military had taught him to be self-reliant, to push through pain, to never show weakness. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. "It's not charity, sailor," Judge Freeman said quietly, seeming to read Gary's thoughts. "You earned this through your service and sacrifice, just as you earned that Purple Heart." Gary took a deep breath. He thought about the stairs he struggled to climb each day, the pain that kept him awake at night, the appointments he found increasingly difficult to attend. Maybe it was time to accept help, not for himself but for Frank Collins and the others who never came home. They would want him to live his best possible life. "Yes, Your Honor," Gary said finally. "I'm willing." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the courtroom. Judge Freeman smiled slightly, the first real smile Gary had seen from him. "Excellent. Mr. Rivera will meet with you immediately after this hearing to begin the process." The judge then picked up his gavel. "Now, regarding the matter of your parking violations." The courtroom grew quiet again. Despite everything that had happened, these were still the official charges that had brought Gary to court. "It is the finding of this court that the defendant's violations were the direct result of circumstances related to disabilities sustained in service to our country," Judge Freeman declared formally. "The fines are hereby waived and the violations will be expunged from the record." He struck the gavel once, the sharp sound echoing through the silent courtroom. "Furthermore, I am issuing a judicial recommendation to the VA hospital that they immediately review and improve their parking accommodations for disabled veterans. It is unconscionable that those who have sacrificed for our country should face additional hardships when seeking treatment for service-related injuries." Gary stood in stunned silence. Not only had his fines been waived, but the judge was using his case to potentially help other veterans facing the same challenges. "Case dismissed," Judge Freeman said, striking the gavel one final time. Then, in a quieter voice meant only for Gary, he added, "Well done, sailor. Your mission now is to take care of yourself. That's an order." Gary straightened his posture as much as his injured leg would allow. Some habits never fade. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As Gary turned to leave, he noticed something extraordinary. Everyone in the courtroom was standing, not because the judge had ordered it, but out of respect. For him. A disabled veteran who had come to court expecting judgment and instead found understanding. 3 months passed since that day in court. Gary Mitchell sat on the small porch of his new ground-floor apartment, enjoying the morning sun. A cup of coffee steamed on the small table beside him. His cane leaned against his chair, within easy reach but not currently needed. The changes in Gary's life had come quickly after that day in Judge Freeman's courtroom. Alan Rivera from the Mayor's Office of Veterans Services had been true to his word. Within 2 weeks, Gary had moved into this accessible apartment in a quiet neighborhood close to the VA hospital. The rent was actually less than what he had been paying for his third-floor walk-up, thanks to a veteran's housing subsidy he hadn't known he qualified for. His disability benefits had been approved with surprising speed. Rivera had explained that Judge Freeman's intervention had helped cut through much of the usual red tape. Now, for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Gary had financial stability. He could afford his medications without skipping doses to save money. He could buy groceries without counting every penny. The transportation service picked him up twice a week for his physical therapy appointments. No more driving on bad days. No more parking problems. The driver, Jeff, was a Vietnam veteran who understood Gary's occasional need for quiet and always respected it. But the biggest change wasn't in Gary's living situation or finances. It was in how he viewed himself and his place in the world. For years he had tried to hide his veteran status, to blend in, to pretend he was fine. Now he wore his Navy cap when he went out. He had put his Purple Heart on display in his living room rather than keeping it in a drawer. He had even started volunteering once a week at the local Veterans Center, talking with recently returned servicemen and women who were struggling with the same issues he had faced. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted Gary's thoughts. He recognized the black SUV immediately. Judge Harold Freeman stepped out dressed casually in khaki pants and a polo shirt, rather than his courtroom attire. This was the 3rd time the judge had visited since that day in court. "Morning, Mitchell," Judge Freeman called as he walked up the path to the porch. "Hope I'm not interrupting your coffee time." Gary smiled and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Not at all, sir. Always time for coffee with a fellow sailor. Let me grab you a cup." "Don't get up. I know where the kitchen is by now." The judge went inside and returned a moment later with a steaming mug. He settled into the chair with a contented sigh. "Much better than my office. Court was particularly trying yesterday." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, enjoying the coffee and the peaceful morning. It still amazed Gary how easily their friendship had developed, crossing the boundaries of rank and circumstance. The judge never mentioned Gary's case or the other court matters he dealt with daily. When they were together, they were simply two Navy men sharing stories and the understanding that came from similar experiences. "I saw the article in this morning's paper," Judge Freeman said eventually, "about the changes at the VA hospital parking lot." Gary nodded. "They've doubled the handicapped spaces and added a shuttle service from the far lot. They're saying it will help hundreds of disabled vets every week." "Your doing, Mitchell. If you hadn't spoken up that day in court, nothing would have changed." Gary shook his head modestly. "It was your doing, sir. You're the one with the influence. I'm just a retired sailor with a bad leg." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that still how you see yourself? Because it's not how others see you now." Before Gary could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. "It's Lily Winters. She's confirming the plans for tomorrow's memorial service." Lily, the young woman who had approached Gary in the courtroom, had stayed in touch. Her grief over her brother's death had led her to organize a memorial event for fallen Afghanistan veterans. Gary had helped her connect with other veterans and military families in the area. What had started as a small gathering had grown into a community event, with expected attendance of over 200 people. "Will you be there, sir?" Gary asked the judge. "Wouldn't miss it. I'm bringing my wife, too. She's eager to meet the man I've been talking about for months." Judge Freeman took another sip of his coffee. "I've been meaning to ask, have you prepared your speech?" Gary grimaced slightly. "Been working on it. Not sure I'm the right person to be speaking. Public speaking was never my strong suit, even before the PTSD. You'll do fine. Just speak from the heart like you did in my courtroom." Gary nodded thoughtfully. "That day, I never expected things to turn out the way they did. I went in thinking I'd get fined or worse. Instead, it changed everything." "For more than just you," the judge said. "After your case, I started asking more questions when veterans appeared in my courtroom. About their service, their access to benefits, their support systems. It's made a difference in how I approach those cases." He set his empty mug down on the table. "And I'm not the only one. 3 other judges in the county have adopted similar approaches. We're working with the Bar Association to provide better training for court-appointed attorneys representing veterans." Gary felt a sense of pride at this news. His story was helping others in ways he never could have imagined. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Judge Freeman continued. "The Mayor's Veterans Advisory Committee has an opening. They meet once a month to advise the mayor on issues affecting veterans in our city. Housing, healthcare, employment, that sort of thing. I think you'd be perfect for it." Gary looked surprised. "Me? I'm not a politician or a community leader. No, you're something more valuable. You're a veteran who's navigated the system and knows where it fails. You've lived the challenges that the committee tries to address. Your perspective would be invaluable." Gary hesitated. 3 months ago, he would have immediately refused such an offer. He would have said he wasn't qualified, wasn't well-spoken enough, wasn't important enough. But that day in court had changed something fundamental in how he saw himself and his worth. "I'll do it," he said simply. "If you think I can help, I'll do it." Judge Freeman smiled, clearly pleased. "Excellent. Their next meeting is Tuesday at 2 p.m. I'll let the chair know to expect you." They talked for another hour, moving from serious topics to lighter ones. The judge shared stories about his early days in the Navy, making Gary laugh with tales of a young lieutenant's mistakes and misadventures. Gary reciprocated with stories of his own, some he hadn't told anyone in years. As Judge Freeman was preparing to leave, he paused on the porch steps. "Oh, I almost forgot, I brought you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue box. "This arrived at my chambers yesterday." Gary opened the box carefully. Inside was a medal, the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. With it was a letter explaining that after review of his service record and the testimonies of fellow servicemen, the Navy had determined that his actions on April 12, 2010, warranted additional recognition beyond the Purple Heart he had already received. "How Gary began, his voice thick with emotion. "I may have made a few calls after hearing your story that day," Judge Freeman admitted. "Asked for a review of your case. Turns out pulling your fellow sailors from a burning vehicle while injured yourself meets the criteria for the achievement. Medal. Should have been awarded years ago." Gary stared at the medal, speechless. After a moment, he looked up at the judge. "Thank you," he said simply. Judge Freeman shook his head. "Don't thank me. You earned it. All I did was make sure the right people knew about it." He extended his hand. "I'll see you tomorrow at the memorial service, Petty Officer Mitchell." Gary stood and shook the judge's hand firmly. "Yes, sir. I'll be there." As the judge drove away, Gary remained on the porch, looking at the medal in his hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal and ribbon. It was recognition of his service, his sacrifice, his worth. Much like that day in court had been. He thought about the speech he would give tomorrow at the memorial service. He knew now what he needed to say. He would tell the story of a sailor who came home wounded in body and spirit, who struggled alone for years until an unexpected moment in a courtroom changed everything. He would talk about the importance of speaking up, of asking for help, of accepting the support that was available. And he would tell them about a judge's unusual request that had brought a courtroom to tears, and had started a ripple effect of change that continued to this day.